All right, everybody. Thank you guys for waiting while we got everything figured out. I think we should be good to go. If you are not able to see the slides, go ahead and just message me in game and I will try to jump to your instance and see if we can get that sorted out. But thank you all for your patience. I am super excited for this talk. I'm so happy that we were able to get David Kennedy to come and speak at this conference. I am going to go ahead and mute the entire room now, so everybody should go on mute. Afterwards, I will enable a hand raises, which will then give you the option to ask questions. So with that, David Kennedy, the stage is all yours.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Really appreciate everybody coming out to hear me talk today, and what an incredible event. I actually feel like I'm here with you all, and obviously during these challenging times, for us to be able to get here together and to share and to collaborate is just an incredible thing. So thank you all for hopping on to listen to me talk today, and just a special thanks to everybody that put this conference on. It's really incredible. It's a first of its kind. Really think it's a really cool thing to do. I was exploring yesterday with my kids, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. So, but with that, I appreciate everybody joining, and let's kick this off. And there we go. So my name's Dave Kennedy. I've been in the security space now for, gosh, I think 20 years, so I'm getting old. But I started my career off working for more of the military intelligence side, got out and became a chief security officer, did a lot of other things around open source development, research, wrote the Social-Engineer Toolkit, was a co-author of Metasploit, the Penetration Tester's Guide, wrote Magic Unicorn, and a number of other open source tools. And my whole career has really been trying to understand offensive capabilities, what we can do to really bring companies together to build better defenses, and really make the security industry better as a whole. With that, I've been very fortunate to be on the news quite a few times, and I don't attest to any specific news organizations. I'm always on CNN or Fox or CNBC or MSNBC or BBC, and that's always been fun. I'm usually not wearing pants when I'm on TV, so most of these pictures here, and especially that one on the right here, if you can see here, I'm definitely not wearing pants here. So I usually try to not wear pants as much as possible whenever I'm on TV. I also helped out with the TV show Mr. Robot, and started a conference with a couple of my friends called DerbyCon and a few other things. So my whole career is based off of security and really trying to help others get better with it and try to help the industry for the better. So welcome. Why we're here today, and I'm going to move around, and I told everybody I was going to start running back and forth here. But I just wanted to say, when you look at what we're trying to accomplish today in security, things have changed quite a bit, and I'll talk a little about kind of the history around where we're at today and why it's so much of a better place than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But when we look at offensive tooling and research that's coming out, Durkion, just as an example, just yesterday released a whole bunch of tooling for being able to do analysis over Azure and Office 365 and the Azure endpoints. The research that we're doing today in this industry is driving the security forward for everything that we're doing. And a lot of people have a lot of problems with releasing offensive security tooling because it may damage the masses. But in many cases, what we're trying to accomplish from a research perspective is to make things better, make things more secure. You look at the healthcare industry as an example. When we started doing medical devices, those medical devices used to be terrible, and a lot of them still are. But they start to build security in those products earlier on, and we start to see the fruits of that labor start to actually occur as we start to get better with security. So, to the researchers out there that are spending their own personal time, and you look at the tool that Durkion wrote, he spent probably hundreds of hours, if not longer, building this tool for him to be able to do research and sharing that with the community, with the InfoSec industry, so that we all can do this type of research is phenomenal. And so, with that, when we look at what we've really accomplished over the past few years, 10 years ago, I remember that, I'd go into an organization, they would be, very immature in nature, and there's still a lot of immature organizations out there, but we'd go into a company, we would destroy them, we'd get access to all their data, we'd walk out, and we'd hand a report, and the company would focus solely on addressing the security vulnerabilities that were identified in that report. So, hey, they had, MSO 8067, they had Eternal Blue, they had, null sessions, they had weak SQL accounts, this specific vulnerability, this patch missing, they had a default Tomcat instance. So you had all these different vulnerabilities that we were explaining to these companies, and what they would do is they'd go and they'd fix the vulnerabilities, and then literally what they would do is they would next year would come in and we'd find 10 more vulnerabilities or 15 more vulnerabilities that would compromise them a different way. And it was a cyclical effect of vulnerability management, which you look at vulnerability management in any organization, and it's probably one of the most challenging things that we have to face in security. Vulnerability management is probably the hardest program that we have to deal with because it interfaces with every single organization out there. You have to deal with pretty much every organization that has an application. And you start getting into the application tier, middleware, databases. Then you get to the operating system, network devices, hardware. And you start to look at that. And you have IoT as a whole other concept with working with our vendors. And vulnerability management touches literally everything that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And it's one of the hardest things to do because none of us have a CMDB. We don't focus on, at least if we do, it's not enriched enough to where we know where all of our assets are, our data that's in there. We might have a decent idea on some of them, but as in general, we really struggle with trying to protect everything in our organization because we don't have enough resources. Vulnerability management probably needs the most amount of resources that we need to accomplish because we have to interface with literally IT, we have to interface with DB administrators, we have to interface with the business on patch cycles and addressing vulnerabilities. Vulnerability management is one of those things that it just takes so much time and effort. And so you look at that and you say, okay, well, we know we're not going to be 100% secure in any way, shape, or form. No one here would state that. You look at 15 years ago, we were trying to build that capsule mentality. We were trying to build a way to keep everybody out. But technology progressed. We went into our cloud environments, and we went into BYOD, and we got all this different things. We started to paint a picture where we no longer have a castle. We no longer have the ability to create an impenetrable wall, and we never really did in the first place. That was kind of a misnomer of how we looked at kind of our security. And you look at things like Azure, for example, and what we're doing in the cloud. And out of the past 12 assessments that I've been on assessing cloud infrastructure for an organization, I broke it into 11 of them. And it's not because the cloud is insecure in any way, shape, or form. It's because of how people leverage technology and not having a good understanding around the complexities with that. Cloud does not equal security. Your internal perimeter does not equal security. Your knowledge around how you structure your program and how you build that out equals security. And I'll talk a little about this here in just a second around how we've really matured. But our mind shift changed recently over the past 5 years of instead of focusing on vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, we're going to try to get better at that, but we know for a fact that we're always going to have a problem where a user clicks on something or we have a misconfiguration and we can be breached in some way, shape, or form. And so our shift changed to things like, hey, what if we do get breached? Can we identify threats in our environment earlier on so the time that an attacker has to dwell in our environment is substantially less? Can we focus on other areas around understanding attack patterns? Things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework is a great example. I'm a huge fan of the MITRE ATT&CK in many cases. I think it has some deficiencies around how we focus on it. It's like any implementation of anything. But now we have a conceptual idea around how attackers are going after things. I remember thinking in a pen test 15 years ago, why don't they just stop lateral movements by not allowing workstation-to-workstation communication? Well, yes, that's a big deal. Why don't they stop pass to hash? Why don't they stop hash extraction? Why don't they look at these common techniques where we're grabbing clear text paths without a memory through WDigest and Mimikatz? Why do we still leverage locally multicast name resolution protocol or MBNS across our network? Common things that we see consistently across the board: Kerber roasting, printer spool attack vectors, using unconstrained delegations. Those are all things that are common attack vectors in pretty much every attack cycle we see. And now it's not perfect. You look at process injection. There's 8 different types of techniques commonly used within process injection. We're not going to have coverage probably against all of them, but can we start to identify things in every phase of the attack? And as an attacker starts to go after an organization, can we minimize that damage and can we identify them faster than not? And this talk, I'm going to talk a little about that, but I'm also going to talk about the next level of red teaming, which you look at some organizations, they are very mature in a number of cases. They have good detection capabilities. They've moved beyond things like MITRE ATT&CK or just having a default EDR product. They've gone beyond it. They actually have a solid monitoring detection program. They have threat hunting. They're looking at things in their organization from a attacker's perspective. And how do we continuously raise the bar for those types of folks as well? And so the current issue problem we look at today is that it's difficult to prioritize the vast amount of tactics, techniques, and procedures that we have out there, the TTPs, where we hear that term all the time. I love Jeff Moss, who started Black Hat at DEF CON, and 2 years ago, he gave a talk at Black Hat right before he introduced the keynote speaker. And he said, as an industry, we talk about the tactics, techniques, and procedures of attackers, but as an industry, we solely focus on the techniques. And that really resonated with me because, you look at the industry as a whole, we have really become static signature based for techniques of the 2020s, of the 1990s. So we're literally taking techniques that attackers have used, whether it's a living off the land, or it's a PowerShell attack, or it's a WMI attack, or it's a specific Excel document that was used for remote code execution and has specific keywords in it, and we tool off of that. We build detections off of what we've seen before traditionally in the past. There's nothing wrong with that, but you look at how attackers change their techniques on a given basis. Magic Unicorn is a great example. Magic Unicorn is a tool that I wrote a number of years ago, 7 years ago actually, I wrote Magic Unicorn. And it's an exploitation framework for PowerShell. And I gave the very first ever PowerShell security talk at DEF CON, and it's called PowerShell OMFG. And Jeff Snover, the father of PowerShell, who created PowerShell, said to me on Twitter, it was actually pretty cool, is like, I consider Dave kind of the father of PowerShell security, which was really a cool testament to that talk. But what's interesting about that, and I have to give Microsoft a lot of credit, they built a lot of capabilities and tools inside of PowerShell, and I would consider PowerShell one of the most secure programming languages out there today, based on everything that you can implement. But you have to implement it. Magic Unicorn is a great example. If you run Magic Unicorn out of the box, Windows Defender will flag on it. And I'll show you some funny examples of getting around that here in just a few minutes. But you look at the defaults, and Magic Unicorn worked for 4 years without any detections whatsoever. And inside of Unicorn, if you manipulate or change just basic strings, you completely circumvent those detection criteria. It's very easy to get around AMSI. It's usually very easy to get around most detections that you have out there because they're looking for specific things. So PowerShell is a great example. Looking for encoded command, looking for kernel32.dll, looking for things inside of base64 encoded strings. Those are going to be common things that most people will look at inside of PowerShell. But if I change or I manipulate my data in some way, shape, or form, I can usually get around most of that type of those types of detections. So we were focusing very heavily on the techniques. We're not focusing on the tactics or procedures that attackers operate by. We should be focusing very heavily on the behavior that specific attacks exhibit. A great example is PowerShell, and is probably one of the most leveraged ways to get code execution onto a system, because it's a full-fledged programming language. With PowerShell, why don't we baseline our environment for what PowerShell looks like in our organization, what communicates out to the internet in the first place, and look for deviations of those patterns? You're looking at things like PowerShell scripts that go out to Office 365. Do we care about that? No, but it's still a script that's going out to the internet. Can we baseline that traffic, put those in as normal traffic, and look for deviations or things that aren't usual in our environment that has network communications, like PowerShell beaking out to the internet in the first place? They're things that we haven't seen before. Those are ways that we can get better at understanding specific ways that tactics that attackers exhibit, then working very specifically off of a technique that we see in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And again, I'm a big fan of MITRE ATT&CK. I think it's a great way to build coverages in multiple phases of an attack. But if your detections are based off of a specific command line argument, and it requires chaining those together, you're going to have really poor detections. Because if I manipulate or change those in some way, shape, or form, you're going to completely miss that specific attack, and I'm going to go in your environment for a long time. Again, if you're Googling something and how an attack works, and you're grabbing regsvr32.exe with the /i and an HTTP in there and using scriptlet objects, I'm going to show you how easy it is to get around those specific detections as we go around and build our detections out. And again, there's so many things that we need to prioritize. Our prioritization focus is still on trying to address vulnerabilities, which I think is very important. But we have to move beyond what we're doing from a detection perspective and looking at traditional static detection. Your EDR products are static detection. They are no better in any way, shape, or form than antivirus from the 90s. And again, they're a great resource of data, of getting information from those tools, but you have to be able to leverage that and build those out as you go along. So right now the bar's low. Most companies are still leveraging AV as kind of their base level of detection. Some companies still have EDRs, which is fantastic. Again, it allows you to have more visibility into your environment, but if you're using those out of the box, you're not really getting much value out of those. Our focus really needs to be on continual testing and improving our testing as we go along. There's some companies that we go into, and it's very difficult for us to compromise our organization. There's a financial institution that we do work with that was really difficult for us to break into. The first time, they absolutely destroyed us. We looked like a bunch of children doing a red team against them. It took us like 4 months, and they just shut us down in every way, shape, or form. And this company that we did an assessment for the second time, we did very well because we understood their capabilities and we rose our bar up to be above theirs. Again, making it much more difficult for them to become compromised in many ways because of that continual elevation. And so if we customize our attacks in any way, shape, or form, if we modify our capabilities and how we do our tooling from an adversary's perspective, we can usually go undetected. Now, again, our whole goal isn't to go undetected. Our whole goal is to build security and build defense in many ways for these companies. But again, our tooling really has to be matching the level of the organizations that we're going after and the bars that they have. And just some breach statistics, we started analyzing all the different breaches that we see on a given basis. There are things that are trying to go for remote code execution. And in general, executables are still a very high bar, which is still surprising to me that we're still dealing with the problems of the 1980s, where still PE files are being used as a way for remote code execution. Even PowerShell downloaders that are going and downloading binaries. PowerShell definitely being the larger second, and then living off the lands being that 14%. And that's where we kind of see a lot of the research going into right now is more so undocumented ways of getting remote code execution through living off the lands as still being an important way for code execution. Obviously, ways that you can get C#, scriptlet objects onto a system, ways that have a lack of visibility into Windows. Those are all going to be things that a lot of people use still to this day. Here's an example of a detection today. Now, this one boggles my mind, okay? So this is Registry R32, which is a very common one for remote code execution. I'm sure a lot of folks see it. Registry R32 is a living off the land. It allows you to go and download code directly from the internet. In this case, a text file that is running a scripted object, and we just call strobj.dll. Now, what's interesting about this is that obviously Microsoft built in a specific detection because we can see here at the very bottom, Windows Defender detected this specific attack from happening. So instead of reducing the attack surface and releasing an update to Registry R32 with no malicious activity, they release a patch, for a signature to basically prevent this from happening in the first place. And that's where I have a lot of problems with what we're doing from an attack surface reduction perspective, is that really, in my opinion, application control is probably one of the most effective ways of blocking most of the attacks that we see out there today, especially if you couple that with user account context around things like living off the land. Should a regular user ever be able to access Registry R32 in the first place? Do they need to? Baseline that environment, baseline MSSP, baseline CBD, CSC.exe, mav inject, and start to knock out a lot of these low-hanging fruit ones that probably aren't going to have an impact in your environment. Put it in monitor mode. You can use App Locker, put it in monitor mode, sit there and monitor everything that's happening in your environment. Would that actually block anything in your environment? No. Put that protection in place, and all of a sudden now you have a larger coverage around a lot of the attack surfaces that we have out there. A good example is PowerShell. Does Bob and Sales need access to PowerShell in the first place? Probably not. Do all of your users need access to PowerShell in the first place? Probably not. Your web developers, IT admins, things like that do. But in many cases, most of the folks don't. Now, so we see here examples of detection today. So we have Registry R32 calling out to the internet as being blocked. Well, if we change this in some way, shape, or form, and just change this a little bit, we can use something like bitsadmin as an example, or we can use excel.exe. Excel.exe can be used as a download. If you give excel.exe a command line parameter for an HTTP site, it'll actually download the file directly to the temp directory in the first place. So we can just use something like that, or we can use bitsadmin. Here we use bitsadmin, and we go out to our website to download that test.txt, which contains our scriptlet object. And then from there, we call Registry R32 without going to HTTP, and we still call these scriptlet object in the first place. So here we can get successful remote code execution on a system and circumventing a pretty easy way of detection. Now, some things on an EDR side, again, this is just AV, low bar to go through. Some detections will look for other things like strobj being called in the first place. Another example of being able to circumvent Windows Defender, in this case, and also probably get around most EDR products, is you can also copy strobj.dll from the System32 directory as a regular user. Again, copy it, move it to a temp directory, wherever you want to put it. If you're a regular user, you can put it in your own documents directory, wherever you want to put it. And from there, you can just rename it to test.dll. And you can run this exact same command up here. Let me go back one slide really quick here, 1 second. So if you go back one slide, there it goes. And you use this exact same string, but instead of doing strobj.dll, you do test.dll, which is that strobj.dll file that you copied, and you move it into your directory as test.dll. This will also completely circumvent this detection criteria. Again, things that you can do as a regular user. It doesn't require admin rights. And if you're copying a DLL, I've never seen an EDR trigger off of copying a DLL to a different name. Now, if you're using something like registry R32.exe and you rename that and you use that, You're obviously going to probably see that because there's a documented Windows API that you can grab the original executable name directly from the file path itself. So if an exe is renamed to moo.exe, you can see that it's actually regsvr32.exe in the first place. So again, easy ways to get around a lot of these detections that a lot of us rely upon on a day-to-day basis. Again, we're not focusing on the behavior or the tactics or procedures that attackers focus on. We're focusing solely on the techniques, and that is a major problem in our industry today. Here's one of my tools, by the way, that I wrote. It's not public yet. I've been kind of going back and forth on whether or not to release it. I'm a huge Star Trek fan. And so from this one specifically, what happened a couple of years ago is that Windows Defender started writing signatures, and a lot of other antivirus products started writing signatures for for PowerShell Unicorn, for Magic Unicorn. And what was interesting about that was my whole goal with Unicorn was to provide tools for people to be able to test PowerShell exploitation and to be able to get better at defense. And I believe it accomplished that because Unicorn was one of the most widely used, still is one of the most widely used PowerShell exploitation frameworks out there today. And what's interesting about Microsoft's approach to this, and this is not a knock on Microsoft, you know, they got a great security team out there, but how they're focusing on addressing this specific problem is such a low bar for organizations. And this is where I really struggle. Do you release tools that try to upend and promote better security from the producers of those products, or do you keep the bar so low to where anybody can go and use a tool and get around the detection mechanisms in the first place? And so what I ended up doing a while back is Windows Defender was releasing signature updates almost weekly for Magic Unicorn. And so I wrote a tool that spins up a virtual machine that has Windows Defender, and it would check out the latest Defender signatures, and then it would automatically submit Magic Unicorn with the automatic sampling turned off, so it would submit my sample up to the cloud, and it would identify whether or not it would, if it was getting detected. If it got detected, it would automatically rewrite the portions that were getting detected and then submit a pull request for me automatically so that it would automatically bypass and detect or bypass all of the AMSI signatures or the Defender signatures that are getting put into place. And so it would do it within about 30 seconds of a new signature being released for Unicorn itself. And so this is my tool. This is part of the process here where it'll automatically tell me the section to rewrite, and then it puts it through an analysis block that automatically rewrites it for me in the first place, and then submits it again to ensure that it's evading detection and that I actually get a shell. So I took the concepts of agile development and DevSecOps and applied it to my process for getting around Windows AMSI signatures for when they're actually released. And what's really neat about it is it actually has pass and fail build. So it'll actually ensure that it actually get a shell back and that it successfully connects as part of that build process. A little funny thing here, ASCII art's amazing. Oh, 1 second. 1 second, there we go. If it gets around it, it automatically says, submit a payload to AMSI. Oh snap, nothing is detected. You're good to go. And I get a nice little smiley face for me to let me know that everything's good. And again, it's all automatic in the background for me. Again, this is an example of AV as a great example. But another case is Trevor C2. I released Trevor C2 at GurCon about 3 years ago. And what Trevor C2 is a command and control framework where it'll automatically clone websites out there. So if you want to clone Google or Facebook or whatever it ends up being, and if you're not browsing, if you go to the C2 server, it'll automatically redirect you to Google or Facebook as a concept if you're just normally browsing it. So from an incident response perspective, if you're looking at that site, it's just going to redirect you to Facebook or Google. However, from a command and control perspective, if you submit the right, there's essentially an AES 256 key that keys up to the server, and if you have the right responses to the server, you can then establish a command and control infrastructure directly to the server in the first place. And what happens is it actually sprays the command and control commands. Let's just say you want to do an ipconfig, for example. It'll actually spray the ipconfig command through the source HTML files of the page itself. And it's all AES 256 encrypted. And then what will happen is that the C2, the compromised client, will go and grab that, read, as emulating a browser, read that content of the server and decrypt it, and then execute those commands, and then exfiltrate that through basically image files. That it looks like it's loading an image file from the server itself. So the exfil data actually comes from loading fake images that aren't really there that ends up being your C2 covert channel through file name extension types. So it looks like from when you're looking at it from you have SSL termination in place, it'll actually look like you're loading just a normal website, and it's not, it doesn't look malicious in any way, shape, or form. And I wrote Trevor C2 over 3 years ago, and just the other week there was a Defender signature update for Trevor C2, and all I had to do was change the variable name encrypted stream to encrypted streams, and I had full evasion through Windows Defender. Again, focusing on the techniques, if I make one tiny modification, completely get around the detection that's in place in the first place. AMSI is a great tool. It has many, many weaknesses and deficiencies because you're still using static signature analysis to do your analysis in the first place. So again, easy ways that we can just get around there. Just recently I just did an update to Trevor C2. It's fully converted over to Python 3, as is Magic Unicorn and all my other projects. So all of those are all fully converted over. And just the other day, yesterday actually, I was on a red team engagement, and it's actually a really funny story. We were starting with this customer. It was supposed to be Monday, this Monday, and we found a pretty big exposure, and we asked the customer if we could start early. And we were able to gain access to this customer through compromised credentials through their Citrix environment that we found more of a backup Citrix environment that didn't have two-factor authentication. And I got into the Citrix environment and got to this person's computer, and I was doing some pillaging on the systems, just browsing. I didn't want to trigger any alarms or anything, so I was just browsing as a regular user on their intranet site. And found a web.config file that had a SQL SA password in it. Just by doing the search, just searching through their intranet site. It was on one of their IT admins pages. And so the web.config had an SA account. Now the problem was I was running under the context of a regular user. There were multiple products in the system itself, and I didn't want to trigger any specific AV or antivirus or EDR products that were on there in the first place. And so I didn't want to do remote code execution of the system. So I didn't have a SOX proxy into this company in the first place at all. But I wanted access to the server environment. And so I started looking for tools that would allow me as a regular user to directly query to a SQL server in the first place. And I couldn't find anything at all as a regular user, not an administrator, a regular user. If I was an administrator, I could use the Microsoft SQL client tooling and use OSQL, which is an older version of that, to directly connect to the SQL database in the first place. And so I ended up writing a tool. I just released it yesterday. It's called QuickSQL. That doesn't require administrative level rights. It's Python, but it's byte compiled into a binary that's not malicious. It's just a direct querying tool that doesn't for SQL that doesn't require admin rights, so it doesn't get flagged by antivirus or anything like that. It's not unusual in any way, shape, or form. And I used that, and I was able to copy it over to the Citrix environment that had direct connections to that SQL server, was able to get into the SA account, spawn the XP command shell store procedure, and compromise the system itself fully, and now I have access to the server environments. And so an easy tool, it's on GitHub. It just uses the PY/MS SQL modules to basically use that as a context to be able to directly connect and query SQL Server. So what will happen is you basically specify the username and password, the database name. If you know it, you don't have to. It'll log it as none if you don't. And then it'll allow you to run direct MS SQL queries without administrative level rights on the box itself. It also works on Linux, OS X, and Windows. So if you want to use it for any of those different platforms, you can absolutely use it. It's cross-compatible, Python 3, et cetera, et cetera. So that just got released yesterday. So you can check my Twitter feed for that one. But again, from a Trevor C2 perspective, I just did a bunch of updates for it. It's not getting picked up by anything that I know of personally, and a way to use command and control infrastructure out there to test red teaming. So some statistics, the basics still work for most organizations. PowerShell is still a viable option for most organizations, not all of them, which still to me, if you're not pulling in PowerShell logs, that's a very big problem from a visibility and gap perspective that you really need to address. Living off the land has been around for years, and it's still a new concept for a lot of companies out there. And that's really problematic because it's a whole avenue of exploitation that most people aren't even looking at. And if you're not familiar with living off the land, just a quick 2 seconds cover of that. It's not just for Windows, it's also for OS X and Linux and Windows. It's an application that's code signed by whomever. It could be a third party, it could be part of the operating system. That has additional functionality that allows you to execute things on behalf of the system itself, like downloading, for example, or executing code like scriptable objects. MSSP is a great example of that, using HTA files to run high-content HTML files for remote code execution. these are legitimate applications and binaries that allow you for doing certain things. Mav inject is a great example, injecting code into memory, just like run DLL32. So just ways that we can get code execution onto the system. Again, still most minor obfuscation techniques still work today, whether it's changing parameter names, it's obfuscating the code. One of the things for the longest time, with Unicorn, I can get around the AMSI stuff, but the problem is when you're using Metasploit, a lot of if you're not using encoding, which encoding increases the size of the shellcode itself substantially, when you're trying to stay within a certain command line argument, like command line, the max amount of characters in a command line is, I think, 2191. So my payload has to be under 2191 characters. And when you start to do things like Shikata or other ones that change it, there are still characteristic patterns inside that shellcode that trigger on Windows Defender. And so what you can do inside of shellcode, and that's what Unicorn does, is it'll do byte replacement. So it'll take like 0x, 0x1b, and it'll replace it with a randomized character like, x at 1b. And so it'll do substitutions for those throughout the PowerShell code itself, and that is very effective against getting around the shellcode detection analyzers that happen directly in memory through AMSI. So again, ways that we can just do minor modifications to get around things. Some companies, again, are more advanced, and your techniques really have to change, and you have to be very careful with what you're doing and how you actually go and do it. One of the tools that we developed internally over at TrustedSec, we call Scoutmaster, which is not a public tool. It's our own C2 command and control infrastructure that we use, and it's written from the ground up in C, and it has been very effective. We haven't had any detections. We've used it for years. And again, if you have custom tooling, you have anything custom whatsoever, you're not going to find anything else out there. You're not going to see anything else out there. It really, right now, we're a commodity, crowdsourced, intelligence gathering community that's focusing primarily solely on techniques. Now, what's an interesting thing here? There's a little bit of a wrinkle in how we're doing things. And here's why I'm going to tell you the push for behavior-driven analysis is going to come sooner than later. It's going to hit us like a truck. And we've all known about social engineering, the dangers of phishing for the longest time, right? We've been talking about social engineering and phishing since, forever. I think, since Kevin Mitnick was doing it and all the phreakers and phone phreakers and things like that in the 70s and 80s were doing it. I know when I was getting into the security industry and I was working with a gentleman called, I won't call him a gentleman, a person named Chris Anengi. We go back and forth, we're good friends. I just like to give him a peck. Chris and I were talking about how no one was leveraging social engineering with their security assessments back then, and that's when we created, Social-Engineer.org, and I created the Social-Engineer Toolkit as a way to do exploitation via social engineering. And what's interesting is that, we look at social engineering from a user problematic perspective. What controls can we put on a user to prevent social engineering from happening? Whether that's sandbox and virtualization techniques, whether that's reputation analysis, whether that's content filtering. What controls your EDR products? What controls can we put into a user? But again, our shift. Remember before when I first started talking, our shift changed from focusing just solely on vulnerabilities to also focusing on how attackers go after an organization, right? That visibility aspect, being able to look at initial access, exploitation, looking at privilege escalation, lateral movement, all of these different things that we change our perspectives on. And so when we look at social engineering is still very much looked upon as the initial access, right? So we look at social engineering as the initial access. What if we, as attackers, change our techniques to know that we need to do social engineering through all of the different phases of an attack? So the story that we tell the Security Operations Center is done based on a social engineering perspective. We're telling a different story. If you look at code, if you look at Magic Unicorn and a security analyst sees Magic Unicorn, what do they think? Well, that's probably malicious as all hell, right? They think that is malicious because it's obfuscated, it's doing exploitation, it's doing SysWall 64 downgrades, it's doing all this stuff. So when a security analyst sees that, they know it's malicious because it looks malicious. But what if what I presented to a security analyst didn't look malicious? We didn't use obfuscation or encryption. We built it into applications that are already being used, that are open source projects, that are legitimate. What if the story we told the security analyst was completely different, knowing that we're going to get busted, knowing that we're going to use a living off the land that's going to get picked up, or we're going to use PowerShell exploitation that's going to get picked up. But what we actually send to the user is completely different. The story that we tell them is completely different. So here's an example of regSCR32, and here's a different story. If an analyst sees regSCR32 in an environment, they are going to think that it's malicious instantly because it is absolutely used all the time for abuse. But again, what's the story I'm telling here? So really quick, excel.exe to a fake website goes and pulls down an XLS file. Is that going to trigger your EDR product? Is that going to trigger your monitor detection? Excel.exe going out and downloading an Excel file? Probably not. Is saving Excel to your temp directory, a user's temp directory, going to trigger an alarm, an Excel file? No macros in it, by the way. No macros, nothing in it that's going to trigger any alarms. The XLS is actually a scripted object. It's just text. But you can embed XLS objects into Excel documents. So, okay, we have a little bit of a scripted object inside of there. We wait a little bit. We're not going to just do this automatically. We're not going to cover a XLS file automatically going and saving to a directory and then renaming something. Renaming SCR, or not renaming, I should say copying SCR obj.dll to a user's temp directory. Is copying SCR obj to a different name in a user's temp directory going to trigger an alarm? Probably not. Now we say rename company name report underscore metrics version 2.3 XLS to DLL uninstall. We're just going to rename the file to DLL uninstall. That's all we're going to do. So we copied SCR obj.dll to schmgt.dll, and we renamed company report.xls to DLL uninstall. The command we execute is regSCR32.exe/s/u/i DLL uninstall schema management.dll. So what's the story I'm telling here? Would a SOC analyst trigger this in the first place as being malicious? Maybe. You have a 50-50 shot at this point, right? You have a 50-50 shot that one, the SOC analyst is going to trigger this as a false positive, or the SOC analyst is going to research this to identify if it is malicious or not, right? It's a 50-50 shot at this point. What's a SOC analyst going to do when they first look at this command if they're going to investigate it? They're going to Google it. They're going to Google it and they're going to say, well, has this been seen before in the first place? What's the first result from Google? It's a TechNet Docs article from Microsoft talking about DLL uninstall being used in conjunction with schema management with regSCR32. So the story we're telling the SOC analyst is completely different than something malicious. Again, we can craft our attacks as an adversary very differently to tell a different story. And this is just one example. I'll tell you one that's even easier. Building a story and I'll tell you the even easier one here in just a second. Building a story takes some time, but it doesn't take any more time than what we have to do to build our C2 infrastructure, to do domain fronting, to get all of our infrastructure set up. We're just telling a different story about how we're going to attack the organization. And so when we tell a different story, the difficulty for a SOC analyst from a defensive perspective becomes much harder. And why? And you're probably in the audience saying, why are you telling us this, Dave? Why are you showing that you can get around our defenses? Because our defenses have to change from technique-driven tooling to understanding behavior in the first place, understanding deviations of patterns of behavior. We are going to get completely destroyed in the next few years if we don't change how we look at defense. Again, this is a maturity thing for us. We changed how we looked at vulnerability management, and that we can't patch everything, and that when we get a pen test report, it shouldn't just be addressing MSO 8067. It should be looking at how the attackers got in the first place and the behavior, the techniques that they were using across the board. We have to change now from just looking at the techniques to behavior. And that is a very difficult thing to do because when you look at organizations, the amount of noise that we have in our environments because we don't do good configuration management and everybody's doing everything differently and there's just standardizations that are not happening across the board, we have to look at it differently. And that probably requires more people. That probably requires more visibility. It probably requires you doubling your Splunk licensing logs because you need more visibility from the log sources that you're getting. But it requires us to be able to do that, to be able to cover what we're going to see tomorrow. And it's going to happen. So here's another example here. So looking at legit scripts, my favorite one to do is going and finding legit scripts off of the internet. What's up, man? How you doing? Hey. That's in room one, sorry. So if you're in the other rooms and you see me just saying hey to somebody random, they were walking across the stage. But when you look at this specifically, you look at finding legitimate scripts on the internet, whether it's AD enumeration, whether it's cleaning up OWA and Exchange. Find the largest friggin' script you can possibly imagine. Like, let's just say it's 1,000 lines, and tuck your code halfway through it. Is a SOC analyst going to go through 1,000 pages of legitimate application? No. Even better, do some OSINT before you go and attack an organization where you do PowerShell exploitation. Do some OSINT and look at LinkedIn and see who the PowerShell administrator is for that organization, right? Or whoever the domain admin is, or the administrator of that group itself. And just put comments in your source code saying, hey, the author is this person from this company, and this is what I'm doing. I'm walking off the stage. I'm going to get more interactive here. These are the things that you can do, right? You can sit there and you can look at that and you can say, listen, this is used for 80 health checks, and this is so-and-so's name that's part of this company that's an AD administrator. Those are things that you could absolutely do to trick users into defenders into actually understanding what's occurring in that environment itself. They're going to see that thing like, oh, I know Bob in AD. I work with them all the time. You can even put hack jobs in there like, hey, I know this code looks like crap, but I needed to do it in order to do backwards compatibility for our native Active Directory infrastructure when we're converting to Azure. Do some storytelling here. Like look at what they're doing. If they have public releases that they're moving to Azure, or they have public releases that they're a tenant in Azure and they're not using it that much, you can write stories in there about what that person was doing at that given time. That when a SOC analyst sees it, they're going to completely lose their minds and be like, oh, this is completely normal. So again, ways that we can just get better for this. So what we have to change and what we have to do differently is first we have to understand our threat models. In order to take this big, massive, vast techniques and tactics and procedures and vulnerabilities and exposures and changing times of our organizations that we have to deal with in a given time, we have to understand who our threats are in the first place. We have to understand what our priorities are. We have to understand the risks that those threats pose to our organizations. And we have to take that with the amount of resources that we have. If we had, I always make this joke to folks, if we had a rule in your organization for HR, for every time you hired a new person for sales or for marketing or for business development or for legal, that you had to hire one security person so that we could have one security person for every one employee in the organization, we would be much better off. We would be an amazing organization because we could just sit behind a person and be like, hey, don't click that. Or hey, they clicked it, let's grab this machine and let's go triage it real quick. Obviously, we are all struggling with priority because we don't have enough people in this industry right now. We don't have enough people working for organizations. They won't spend enough money on the resources. They'd rather spend more money on tooling. And that's a big problem we have. You can't prioritize when you don't have enough people. You can't understand these 10,000 things that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis when we have 30 meetings that we have to accomplish on a given basis in the first place, when I can't spend 4 hours flunking or going through my log data, going through Elasticsearch and understanding what type of data we have in the first place. We have a problem around timing. So the only way that you fix that is priority and understanding what your highest risks are towards your organization. That comes directly from threat modeling. Understanding your threats towards your organization, prioritizing what those adversaries are, their capabilities and techniques, and then working on building up behavior analytics and behavior detections in your environment itself. That is the only way that we are going to get better at what we're doing. The more coverages we have in phases of behavior through all the phases of an attack, the better we're going to be as an industry. I guarantee it as I sit here today. I said, in 2000 and I think it was 9 when PowerShell beta first came out, and I was on stage at DEF CON. I said PowerShell is going to be the next wave of attacks that we see out there from an exploitation perspective. And lo and behold, the security PowerShell industry was born right after that and was used, and it's used in attacks as you see here today. I guarantee you, as attackers start to run into more challenges around their traditional techniques, we will continue to see it become much more difficult for us to go after things. What if I'm an attacker and I launch an attack of 50 different attacks that are all getting caught, and I have one in there that looks legitimate? What's going to happen at that point in time? You're gonna miss it. That's a problem that we have today. Last but not least, I want to say that when I talk about adversary emulation, I talk about getting around things. I talk about circumventing controls. It's because our bar has to continuously go up. And the only way that our bar goes up is by red and blue working together. And red and blue are so much stronger when we work together as a team than we are fighting one another. And that is working responsibly. I'm really pissed off about how we handled the Zoom situation, where we're dropping 0 days and all those other things on the internet without working on trying to address it. We weren't focusing on the health of the industry or the health of that company. We're focusing on getting in the news and scaring people. And as an industry, we have to be responsible. And I don't know the balance on offensive security tooling. I've always erred on the side of we should get tooling out there for people to do better research. We should get things out there to help people out, but we should do it responsibly in a way that doesn't impact others. Same thing for exploits and 0 days and things like that. When the whole NetScaler thing, the Citrix NetScaler thing came out, we were second to drop a 0 day for Social-Engineer, and it wasn't because we didn't have the 0 day. We hadn't had it for several weeks. It's because we didn't want to drop a 0 day to the internet that could have a massive impact on the safety of people. Now, the security researchers that dropped the 0 day, I disagree with them dropping, and they've come out and since apologized for it. But we released our tooling so that people, once it was already out, could have a safe way to effectively test their environment to see whether or not if it was problematic in their environment. Those are things that we need to focus on. We need to work together, red and blue. It's not about smashing things. It's not about destroying things. It's about making an organization better. It's about making the industry better. And blue's always had that in mind. Red hasn't, but we've definitely changed. We need to work together. I see a lot of red hating lately, and I think that's a really legacy view of how the red team views going after organizations. Don't get me wrong. I love getting shell. I love destroying a company. I love getting access to everything that is there. That is why I joined the security industry. But you know what's even more rewarding? When next year I go into that organization and it's 10 times harder for me to break in the first place and I'm frustrated. That is what we're trying to accomplish here in this industry. That's what we're working together for, and we can all do it together and get better. Focus on behavior, focus on techniques. I'm not saying eliminate techniques. I'm saying get better at what we're actually doing out there and building up upon what we actually do. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. I'll take some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and enable question mode, so everybody should see the option to raise your hand. If you have a question for Dave, just click that raise your hand button and we will give you access to the mic. First question up is from VR Jumps. VR Jumps, you are on air.
Sorry. No worries, man.
Cool. If you actually have a question, go ahead and hit that again. Otherwise, the next question up is from Fibonacci. Oh, maybe not. I think that might have been an accidental hand raise.
Don't be scared. I don't bite.
Yeah.
We're in VR. We're good. If you got a question, raise your hand. If not,
all right. We have a question from Michael. Michael, you are on air, sir. Michael? All right, we will go ahead and dismiss that. I think a few people maybe are using the raise hand as a way to clap. So we'll just keep going through the list. Jay, you are on air with questions.
What headset are you on?
oh, what headset am I?
Yeah.
Okay, good question. 1 second. You can see the HyperX Cloud 2. Do I sound good?
Do you what?
Do I sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I got the. I think
you
it's
can move your hands.
Oh, yeah. So I'm not using. Oh, the headset as far as. So I'm using a 2D mode. I didn't want to be on the Oculus when I did my presentation. I'm actually going to hop onto my Oculus afterwards and join everybody 3D wise. But I'm using I wanted to make sure I had perfect everything walking around and didn't have any major problems while I was speaking. So good question.
We've got a question from Jonathan. Jonathan.
Hey, Dave. Good to see you again. Haven't seen you since the first DerbyCon, actually.
Oh my gosh. Long time no see, man.
Yeah, it's been a bit. So actually in my company, we tried to enable PowerShell logging to try to start building some of the behavior and baselining like you've been talking about.
Yep.
And all we managed to do was blow up our SOC.
Yes.
So you got any points to talk?
Absolutely.
Hey, Brian, go read.
Yes, absolutely. So that is a great question, and that is one that a lot of companies really struggle with. So if you enable things like script block logging, for example, it's like sending an IM cannon throughout your network. The amount of data that you're going to receive is going to be more so than anything else out there in the first place. So you have to be very prescriptive on the type of data that you're pulling back from PowerShell in the first place. My recommendation would be to use something like Sysmon, which is a free tool from Mark Rusanovich's team over at Microsoft. I'm a huge fan of that. What's nice with Sysmon is it will log PowerShell, but you can be very descriptive on the rule sets that you use and the type of data you send back. On average, if you take something like Olaf's MITRE attack mapping, and part of that is PowerShell logging, it ends up being about 24 megabytes per endpoint per day, which is a really watered down amount of data that you're actually pulling back. And so doing things like with Sysmon, a recommendation that I would have for you is if PowerShell is being used in the first place and has network connections associated to it, then send it back for analysis, and then start to baseline and tweak out the things with that sysmon configuration that you don't want to see in the first place. And what you can do with the sysmon config is you can exclude things from being sent up in the first place. So you can whittle down and water down the amount of data you have through sysmon configuration management. That's my number one recommendation would be baseline your environment, whittle down that data that you're getting sent back, but also look at it from a use case perspective around how things are going to happen and how you're going to actually address that. Enabling script block logging is a great visibility resource, but there's no way a human can intelligibly go through all that data in the first place. You have to do it based off of criteria. So what is the behavior that attackers exhibit when they use PowerShell? Now you can argue, well, if you're using something like PowerSploit, they're not necessarily going to trigger the network communications in the first place, but they do still need a way for execution or command and control on the system in the first place itself. So monitoring things like network communications out, looking for unusual behavior or PowerShell. I'm a huge fan of Markov chaining or parent-child process relationships. Looking at that is a very good way of visibility of unusual behavior in your environment. Why is Outlook.exe spawning a child process of Excel.exe spawning a child process of PowerShell? Another good example is why is PowerShell hooking into other processes like LSASS or other things in the first place? Ways that you can stay within the Markov chaining itself, and those are things that you can do directly within sysmon as well. So scale it from the sense of not sending everything back, because that's just too much data, but more so on the behavior that those exhibit when an attacker goes and compromises it. Good question.
Great, thank you. We've got time for a couple more here. Next up is Eric, or Venom260. Eric, you're
Howdy,
on.
howdy.
Hey there.
Wonderful platform to host this conference. Bravo, this is kick-ass. My question is, when you're consulting and working with traditional industry companies, insurance, banking, manufacturing, what typically is the biggest lacking skill set most full-time hired security teams don't have that you found?
That's a great question. I think the biggest problem. So let's just take the concept of what we talked about in the presentation of our shift towards understanding attack patterns through multiple phases of an attack, right? The lack of understanding in that type of model, and it's still very much on the we have to fix every vulnerability, is the biggest lack of visibility. And why that happens, by the way, is that if you look at a security operations center, where the security operations center just stays stagnant. They're looking at commodity things that are coming out there. 90% of the stuff that they're getting is false positives. They're on alarm fatigue. What really, to me, was the biggest missing link in security was threat hunting. And the reason for that is that threat hunting is the mindset that we're already compromised, and we got to comb through the data to figure out where that compromise occurs. And it may not have happened, but it will someday down the road. And so a threat hunter has to understand indicators of compromise. They have to understand attack patterns. They have to understand different phases of an attack. They need to comb through DNS logs, command line arguments, parent-child process relationships, PowerShell, east to west, north to south traffic, all this stuff that we can do from a visibility perspective. And what that does is it changes the mindset of the security operations center looking for a commodity alarm, and more so with that threat hunter building out the security operations center to look for unusual behavior. And that is really the emphasis around the morph of what I'm talking about here, is that to me, most companies lack, threat hunting capabilities or the ability to even do it. I'm not saying if they have somebody dedicated, just going through threat hunting exercises on a regular basis, whether it's weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly. Those are things that you should be doing on a regular basis to understand where your gaps of visibility are and what you should really be doing to focus on from a behavior perspective that you might be missing. And I think when you focus your mind on that we're already breached, that we're looking through different phases of an attack throughout our organization, the rest of your security operations center changes and morphs into a very mature state that can handle a lot of these types of things that we're talking about. But great question. Thank you.
Great, we have time for one more question. The next one is from Bren. Bren, you are on air. Bren, if you have a question, you go ahead and ask now. Otherwise, we'll give it to somebody else. Okay. Then the next question is from Raymond. Raymond, you're on air.
Okay, hello, good morning.
Morning.
Hello.
Morning. My question is, it is possible that two-factor authentication is bypass? Is it possible to bypass two-factor authentication?
Yep, great question. So the question was, is it possible to bypass two-factor or multi-factor authentication? That really depends on the implementation, but absolutely it is. Multi-factor authentication is not a 100% security mechanism for an organization, but it is absolutely a great one. Every organization should be implementing that. If you looked at a breach statistic from last year from Microsoft, 99% of the breaches that the incident response team over at Microsoft could have prohibited would have been prevented by two-factor or multi-factor authentication. It is a massive way to protect organizations. But as adversaries get more and more sophisticated, there are absolute ways of controlling, again, the theme or the story that you tell a user. Controlling the multi-factor authentication process where they enter in the multi-factor authentication token into the attacker's version and automatically replay that into the thing itself. I actually had a tool that I was going to submit a call for papers for DEF CON a number of years ago. I never ended up finishing it, which would take, this is probably 5 or 6 years ago, which would you'd phish a user, let's just say it was OWA or Office 365. It would take the username and password, and it would automatically, tell the user to prompt them for two-factor authentication, and the user would enter it into there, and I hooked into the Office 365 APIs to automatically log me in and basically give you like a interpreter shell that kept that session alive for two-factor authentication in the first place. And this was 5 years ago. And so it is absolutely possible to circumvent multi-factor authentication, especially when you control the story or the context of what the user is inputting. Another great example is push notifications. Out of the past probably 15 or 20 engagements that I've gone on where organizations use push notifications, where if you have you can enter in obviously from like an authenticator app, you can do a text message, you can do phone calls, you can do push. Probably the past 15 or 20 assessments that I've been on from a organization that uses push as their default, I've been logged into roughly about 90% of them, because when the push notification goes to the user, they assume that they're automatically logging in somewhere in the first place and they hit approve. 90% of the assessments that I've gone through literally just hit approve, and their users just don't even notice the difference. So there are ways to circumvent multi-factor authentication. There's also ways of being able to do brute forcing and analysis around things like endpoints with Azure and things like that allow you to circumvent the controls for brute forcing user accounts. So there are ways of grabbing credentials and things like that still directly through cloud environments that are still leveraging multi-factor authentication. So again, to your question, yes, it is absolutely possible. It just depends on the sophistication level of the attacker. Again, I'm not advocating that multi-factor authentication isn't a bad thing. I'm a big fan of using hardware tokens like YubiKeys and things like that for authentication. I think that's about the only way you can do it. But if your company uses two-factor authentication using things like authenticator apps, Microsoft's Authenticator is a great app for one-time passwords. Don't use text message based ones, and don't use push notifications or phone calls. But thank you for that question. That was a good question.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We still have a couple questions. I know we're at an hour, but we actually have a break after this set of talks. So Dave, if you're okay, we can let people ask a few more.
Sure.
All right, cool. So next is Shannon. Shannon, you are on air. Maybe. Hold on. Seems to be lagging for me. 1 second. For some reason, I cannot enable Shannon. So Shannon, if you'd like, you can just DM me the question. Otherwise, we'll send it over to somebody else. Next up is Socks. Socks spelled with a 5. You're on air. Nope. All right. We might have just had a couple extra laying on. So what we will do is we're going to go ahead and condense these rooms down into one in just a little bit. If you have questions, feel free to hang out. We'll turn off mute so that everybody in the room can actually talk. That'll make it a little bit more noisy. But if you do have questions for myself or any of the speakers, feel free to just head up to them and talk to them in person or virtual person. Thank you so much, Dave, for speaking. It was great to have you here.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, and Trenton. Thanks so much for setting this up and managing this, and the whole team here for making this happen. This is absolutely incredible. I actually feel like I'm with you all right now during these challenging times, and that I'm actually with some people. So that is a really refreshed change for me. And thank you all for what you do. This is really incredible.